This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy.
They did. I went to the Pac-12 tournament, and Stanford has a tree as a mascot. I know they're the Cardinals, but they have a guy in a tree.
The Cardinal, singular.
Cardinal.
Yeah. Name 10 schools that have whose mascot is singular, not plural.
Cardinal.
Give me another one.
Hold on. Who's yours? Boilermakers.
Oh boy, this is going to take a while.
Hawkeyes. Yeah.
Meanwhile,
Illini.
Yeah, that's one.
Boom! I got two. I'm out.
All right. We'll continue that all morning. I'll fill in the rest of the blanks, but I'll give you some time to think about it.
Okay.
Maybe add some more. University of Michigan, they're the Wolverines, plural. Yeah.
Thank
the Harbaughs. This is interesting from our friend Mark Perry, who's an economics professor at University of Michigan. You know how there's $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, a delinquency rate of about 11%, and people are struggling to get a return on the investment they make in higher education when you're talking about piling up six figures in debt to get your BA. University of Michigan employs I should preface this by saying, in terms of the college spend, why in part is college spend, along with healthcare spend, so far outpacing inflation, much less a middle-income family's ability to pay? Administrative positions at colleges and universities grew by 60% between the years 1993 and 2009, 10 times the rate of growth of tenured faculty positions. The eduocracy. The University of Michigan, for example, employs a diversity staff of nearly 100. 93 full-time diversity administrators, officers, directors, vice provosts, deans, consultants, specialists, investigators, managers, executive assistants, administrative assistants, analysts, and coordinators. More than a quarter of those diversicrats, as Mark Perry calls them, earn annual salaries of more than $100,000. The total payroll for this small army at University of Michigan, 93 diversity staffers, $8.5 million. You add the estimated 32% in terms of cost for the fringe benefit package these individuals get, and that compensation total goes to north of $11 million. The vice provost for equity and inclusion and chief diversity officer at Michigan makes, what do you think?
Oh, I don't even want to know. But I have a feeling you're going to tell me.
Michelle Obama range.
$350?
$400,000.
What?
Mm-hmm.
It's ridiculous.
All the way down to the 26th north of $100,000, who's the EEO / diversity rep senior for the Office of Institutional Equity. Okay, but we're winning. We're winning on the college campuses. We're winning the culture war, or as Rostoth had said, we've actually lost it, and we're substituting it for the pop culture war to salve our feelings. Well, how about at Stanford Law? We like to go to the elite institutions. Normally, we're on the East Coast, but Stanford has been for a while one of the premier law and business schools. I mean, undergrad too. But law and business schools, most notably, with the lowest acceptance rate and so forth, very prestigious. Martin Salvucci is a law student there, and he wrote a piece for National Review, Political Correctness at Stanford Law, which, maybe I'm becoming a bit inured to these stories that we cover routinely in our Campus Beat segment. When you're talking about students attacking professors like at Middlebury for the crime of walking around campus with Charles Murray, maybe I'm getting a little bit desensitized to just the normal totalitarian re-education that goes on college campuses, the projection of things that the professors and administrators are not, like intellectually curious and inclusive and tolerant of viewpoints that are not their own. Well, Stanford Law, Martin Salvucci reports, no more than 3 of the approximately 110 full-time faculty publicly identify as conservative or libertarian. As a consequence, many of my classmates will graduate having never engaged with a law professor whose worldview and convictions track those of nearly half the voting public. My classmates demonstrate little willingness to identify publicly with anything associated with conservatism or, God forbid, President Trump, no matter how trivial. By example, Martin Salvucci cites the law school Republicans on the campus of Stanford will soon cease to exist as a student organization because after a campaign of intimidation and opprobrium, not one underclassman would volunteer to serve on the board of the law school Republicans next academic year. You know, everybody's got to be the team player, just like so many are in their corporate environments these days. Certainly if you're a member of in a leadership or subordinate role at a cultural institution of any import, with the exception of maybe Hillsdale College and a handful of others, you got to be a team player. And so that's the experience that Martin Salvucci writes about in this National Review piece, contrasting it to the experience he had when he was at the University of Chicago. And just to put a real world, real time example to what we talk about on college campuses all the time, pleased to have Martin Salvucci, Stanford Law student, join us now. Martin, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Really appreciate being here.
So you were at the Lumen Christi Institute. I remember I met you there when you were at University of Chicago, and I just wonder if you could contrast what your experience was during your time in Hyde Park as compared to your time in Palo Alto.
Well, the weather's certainly better out here, for starters.
Yes.
But I would be hard-pressed to think of two more different universities. I mean, Stanford is a very user-friendly place. I think, you know, we have so much money that the answer is pretty much always yes, and the obsession is in user experience. It's very Silicon Valley. You know, Chicago, by contrast, I mean, if you ask for heat in the winter, you know, the impertinence of it is sort of horrifying to, you know, the person that you're asking. I mean, you're getting a University of Chicago education, you know, like how dare you want to go to bed without, you know, wearing 10 layers of clothes. I mean, that's just part of the experience. But on an intellectual level, I mean, there's also just no comparison. You know, in Chicago, there are no intellectual taboos. It's a serious place. I think it vindicates the vision that, you know, people like John Masefield had for a university more effectively than probably any other institution in the country, whereas Stanford is just not a serious place. I mean, I think here it's perfectly acceptable and indeed increasingly expected that someone can and will shut down what would otherwise be a sort of mainstream policy debate through some allegation of this is racist or this is sexist or some other sort of ism, and I think we all suffer as a result. I mean, it impoverishes the discourse, and I think the quality of the education that all of us receive as a result is suboptimal.
You mentioned in your article that some parties tore down posters advertising a recent program on abortion. What was that all about?
Yeah. So I'm very involved with the Stanford Federalist Society, and the Federalist Society, for those sort of unfamiliar with it, is an organization of conservative and libertarian-oriented lawyers deeply concerned by the state of the current legal order, and we try to arrange conversations around controversial contemporary topics in legal discourse. And we had a program on abortion back a couple of months ago where we had a woman coming from the East Coast who was criticizing the regime of reliance-oriented jurisprudence after Casey, and then we had somebody from the Stanford campus who was going to respond to her. One of the hallmarks of Federalist Society events is that we always try to have a respondent, usually coming from a different ideological perspective. I think we're the only campus organization that's known to do that regularly, ironically. And what we noticed, I think the morning of or the morning before, it was the morning of, was that the posters that we put up around campus, many of them, I think almost all of them, were torn down and sort of left where they fell, which was concerning to us. And it seemed pretty obvious what had happened. And when we went to the administration and we asked them to sort of help us through this, the suggestion was that perhaps, and you know, I emphasize, I mean, they didn't say this happened for sure, but the only possibility that was posited was that our facilities staff, in their zeal to enforce the rules on postering, had torn these things down, which just seemed like a sort of risible falsehood to me, at least.
You reference in your piece that Stanford, the professors there encourage or are tolerant of diversity of opinion, sort of in the same way INCSOC was, or there was some other Orwellian reference I'm misremembering. But I mean, give us an example of it. This is arguably the best or in the top 2 or 3 law schools in the country, and it's rather. I still find it rather remarkable that they pay homage to being open-minded and let's have arguments and substantive arguments, and particularly for legal training, you got to be able to argue both sides. And yet what you're describing is something, as you said, where you're only getting one point of view, you're only getting one line of argumentation, and you're expected to hew the orthodoxy.
Yeah. So it's not total. There are at least a handful of professors who do make a good faith effort. I mean, one of the 3 conservatives, Professor former Judge Michael McConnell, is really good about this and forces conservative students to make sort of left-leaning arguments in class with some regularity. I think there are some professors outside the sort of narrowly political fields, Joe Bankman and Sachs and Lisa Willett and intellectual property, who really take this sort of pedagogical aspect of viewpoint diversity very seriously. But in the main, particularly the public law scholars at Stanford, they don't make a terribly serious effort. And a lot of the things that you hear in the classroom are just sort of horrifying. I mean, the day after Trump was elected, one of my classmates reported back to me that he was told by his civil procedure professor that this was sort of akin to the day after 9/11 when she was a law student here. Another professor, a first-year professor, this year, chain migration is a racist term that shouldn't be used. In my own experience, I'd say, again, referencing a Federalist Society event where we had somebody in from the Heritage Foundation talking about criminal justice reform in a sort of very forward-thinking way. Professors, very prominent empiricist, got up in front of everyone and said, I agree with everything that our friend John Malcolm just said. And then proceeded to go into a slideshow about how anybody who supported Trump was a white supremacist, and Trump and Dylan Roof, the guy who killed all those poor people in Charleston several years ago, were intimately connected on some philosophical level. And there's really sort of no adult minding the store when these sorts of things happen. And that's concerning to me, because while my classmates, to some degree, are still children, and children can be expected to behave badly now and forever. There's nothing new under the sun. The people who were supposed to be the adults, I think, at this moment in history, for whatever reason, have totally abdicated their responsibility, and that's deeply concerning. And I don't think it's the sort of thing that institutions like this survive easily. To your point, Dan, I do think it's the case that judges and potential employers understand the problems here. I mean, in the real world, as you know, as a former practicing lawyer, opposing counsel is zealously going to represent all of their best arguments, even if you find them distasteful. Judges have a wide variety of perspectives, especially outside of the Northern District of California. And frequently your clients will have done things that you find to be objectionable, and they still demand the same quantum of effort on your part. So, yeah, it's deeply concerning, and I don't see it getting better.
Well, the team player argument that you make too, that you're sort of getting to that with what you were describing, and this is the culture that pervades all of our cultural institutions, perhaps most aggressively in higher education. And just like, I disagree with what's going on, but hey, look, I'm just here for 3 years to get out, to go to some a blue chip law firm, make a bunch of money, or go on to some outstanding success in some other field. I'm not going to rock the boat. The kind of not rocking the boat in the face of this sort of intolerance you see over and over again, even at Stanford.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say that the feedback that I've gotten to the essay has been in volume overwhelmingly positive, but what's been concerning regarding the positive feedback has been the sheer number of emails or conversations that I've had from or with my liberal classmates who said some version of, Martin, we disagree politically, but I agree with most or all of what you wrote in the essay. I think it's important that somebody says this. It requires a non-trivial degree of courage. And, oh, by the way, please don't tell a soul that I, name X, believe any of this. I mean, and it's happened now double-digit numbers of times in the last week. And if I were a senior administrator, at Stanford, either in the law school or the university, or a trustee or a potential employer, again, I would look at that fact and I would need to take a long look in the mirror about what's going on, because it's obvious that this is a problem that's not just affecting them, students like me or the other 5 right-wing students on this campus, but that it's seen as a problem by a great many people who don't necessarily want to subscribe to the lies that, for one reason or another, are sort of all expected to, as you said before, hew to as orthodoxy.
Well, history's always changed by the committed few. So we got you and 4 other guys at Stanford. We got John David Rice Cameron, who is Susan Rice's son, who's a member of the College Republicans. California College Republicans. So there's a ray of hope. He calls Mark Levin his intellectual political hero.
Oh, that's good.
So there's some seeds being planted out on the West Coast. Martin Salvucci, Stanford Law student, the piece on National Review, PC at Stanford. I tweeted it out at Dan Proft. You can check it out, and you should. Martin, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
And he joins us on our turnkey.pro